On climate, all major parties have proposals to tackle the issue. How will they do that specifically? That is what we're going to examine this morning with Michael Serapio. Once again, good morning.
Good morning, Heather. And you're right, just about every major party has a party platform when it comes to climate change, with one notable exception. Parties acknowledging that climate change is an issue and a challenge that needs to be tackled. Again, all but one. Now, let's talk about the approaches, though, because that's what's different, beginning with carbon targets. For example, the incumbent Liberals are aiming to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030, with the goal of reaching net zero by 2050, and also pledging to ensure that the oil and gas sector will cut its industrial emissions to meet that net zero goal. Now, as for the NDP, they're promising a more ambitious target. They want 50% below 2005 levels by 2030, also achieving net zero electricity by that same year, moving towards 100% non-emitting electricity by 2040, and also promising to end all fossil fuel subsidies, including federal support for pipelines. Now, the Greens go even higher. They are pledging to slash greenhouse gas emissions by 60% below 2005 levels by 2030, canceling pipeline projects, banning fracking, and eliminating subsidies for the fossil fuel sector. And as for the Tories, as we heard right off top, Aaron O'Toole and his team are taking a different tack. The Conservatives did oppose the Liberal net zero legislation earlier this year, and their plan would aim to reduce emissions to 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. That is the original Paris target and is also the lowest of the publicly stated targets, but a target that Conservatives say is more realistic, more achievable, which Justin Trudeau took issue with at the Leaders' Debate. Take a listen.
Plan is to go back to the Harper targets, to the Harper approach on fighting climate change, which doesn't work. His costed platform, which he just put out last night, cuts $2 billion from climate investments and from things.
Now, as for the Bloc Québécois, the party does support meeting and exceeding the Paris targets, and I mentioned that one notable exception early on, Heather, and that would be the People's Party of Canada. Their platform argues there is no scientific consensus that human activity is driving climate change.
So differences on emissions targets, Michael, as you've laid out, and also on how to reach those targets. Take us through that.
Yeah, and the primary way would be through carbon pricing, which is steering people to more environmentally friendly options by making polluting options more expensive, so the argument goes. And of course, the Liberals already have a carbon tax that sits at $50 a ton. They would raise that to $170 a ton by 2030 in provinces without their own carbon pricing. 90%, they say, of personal carbon taxes going back to consumers through rebates. Now, the Greens would raise carbon pricing to the highest publicly stated one, $275 per ton by 2030, with the party promising to offset the cost by making unspecified tax cuts in other areas, although we know that low-income tax brackets would be a part of that equation. Now, as for the NDP, they're promising to continue with carbon pricing but provide no specific target for costs. And as for the Conservatives, well, they're looking at $50 a ton by 2030 for personal carbon taxes, which is important because the money raised by those taxes, according to the platform, would go to carbon saving accounts for individual Canadians, and those personal savings could then be used for environmentally friendly purchases, so the argument goes, for things like an electric vehicle. And as for the Bloc Québécois, well, the party is proposing to eliminate the carbon tax, but in provinces where per capita emissions are lower than the Canadian average, which then is probably no surprise to hear, Heather, that Quebec does have the lowest per capita emissions in the country. Of course, Quebec being the primary target for the Bloc Québécois votes.
Michael, thank you very much for steering us through the various party platforms on this, a key issue for many Canadians. If you want to read more about it, Emily Chung has done further analysis up online this weekend. It is there for you this morning at CBCNews.ca. But we also want to bring in Janice McGregor on this, the importance of the issue, Janice, and the strategies behind each of the parties and how they're planning to address it.
Yeah, woulda, coulda, shoulda, Heather. But, you know, I think a lot of people think that were we not in a pandemic right now, was if COVID-19 wasn't so top of mind for people, that this election, you know, this period in our politics could very easily have been very much dominated by the climate change debate. We saw in 2019, for example, the lack of a credible climate plan was a big part of Andrew Scheer's difficulty in their postmortems about that campaign. A lot of Conservatives talked about how they heard about this at the door. The fact that their party wasn't taking this seriously enough was seen as disqualifying in a number of key seats that they really needed to win, particularly in Ontario. But here's the challenge for the Conservatives. Yes, they do have more of a plan this time. They can lay out concrete things they say they would do, but it is the least ambitious of the plans. That maybe has to be by design. We know that their base, as you know, symbolized in a vote they took when they had a party convention, is the most climate skeptic. They can't afford to lose those voters. It's also very difficult to balance support for the fossil fuel industry and the economic engine that is Western Canada with tough climate change action. The NDP, important to note, has always kind of voiced high ambitions here, but they have been raked in their platform for not having specific targets, not having kind of, you know, whether it's a carbon price or other things, kind of a how to get there from here sort of roadmap, which takes people back to the Liberal plan. Experts acknowledge that there is now a solid plan coming from the Liberals. The problem with them is credibility. 6 years in office, very slow progress, despite the fact that they were elected in 2015 saying they'd make this a big priority. You can say, well, you know, they had Trump in office. It was difficult to go too far. They had provinces fighting them in court. It was difficult to go too far. But the fact is they were very slow to come to this place of having a big plan. And for those who look to a past record to predict the future, that's where people are finding they're not feeling that confident with the Liberals.